We are about to embark in the most consequential intellectual undertaking, certainly of my life, but potentially some of your lives as well. And I am embarking on this journey without having the end destination completely defined. And there are a lot of things that will reveal themselves to us if we're able to chart the course of what I'm setting out to do today. And what I'm setting out to do is I want to map via a in-depth study of every consequential network that has been impactful throughout human history. Now, you may wonder why I'm setting out on this endeavor. See, I have a simple hypothesis, but it will take a lot of effort and information to prove the hypothesis. My hypothesis is that all of human history, every progression, every epoch, every transformative invention, every kingdom, every civilization, every accomplishment is nothing but a series of collective network updates. I believe that humans and now machines are nodes in collective processing machines that live within our brains and orchestrate human coordination so that the species and maybe the artificial species in the future can propagate and extend its life. I came on this hypothesis through an obsession of networks which has plagued me for the better part of a decade. Creating a brand, which is really more of a pursuit, which is really this show called the network economy. And that is the title of this show. I'm Shorupan. And I want to chart every network in human history that has meaningful impact. And I want to understand why networks emerged. I want to understand how the various networks functioned, what made them unique, what made them similar, and how this ubiquitous organizing function of human civilization is about to go into overdrive as humans are on the precipice of blending with machine networks. And there's no better way to try and make sense of what's happening in the present and take our folly bets on what will happen in the future than by understanding the past, by decoding as many networks as possible. And that's what we're going to try to do here on the network economy. Each episode will be a narrative deep dive into the origin and inner workings of a specific network. We may be talking about a biological network like the early networks of human existence, and then we may do an episode on something as specific as a religious network, a commercial trade network, a gang network, a criminal network, a political network. Some of the more famous names that have haunted and facilitated power in parliaments and government buildings and the hallways of power as far back as humans have recorded them. So it's going to be a really exciting and interesting journey. Now, myself, founder, first and foremost, I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Garage, where we try to organize every business's network. My interest in the network economy is not one without personal gain, but my obsession with networks goes far beyond what my day job can satisfy. And we're going to uncover so much over the episodes in this show, and I'm very grateful for all of you. So without further ado, I decided for episode 1 that we would go back all the way to the very beginning and answer what could be the most important question in the network economy's entire endeavor, which is, why do humans rely on networks when other animals do not? The reliance on networks, not for flourishing, but for survival, is so ancient, is so deeply ingrained into the fabric of our evolutionary makeup that once you learn on what makes us desire networks, it will be of no surprise to any of you that networks are the single most important innovation in the history of humanity, and it is the single reason that humans have been able to conquer the world. The network that we are going to be breaking down is the most close-knit, kinship-aligned, inclusively altruistic, nuclear network that all of us, in some way, shape, or form, are exposed to, which is the immediate family network. And I started by making episode 1 about the explanation of why the family is the original and most important network in all of our lives. And it is the basis, the building block for every subsequent network. And then I realized it's going to take a lot more than one episode to get through just how intricate, sophisticated, remarkable the origination of the family network actually is. So in today's episode, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be setting up the historical conditions that our ancient ancestors were exposed to, which forced them to outsource this ever so critical part of their cognition to a collective network state. Well, which we'll learn in this episode is that it's not humans, but why did our predecessors versus other animals choose, or maybe not choose, but be forced into a state where they developed networks as the building block for their species? So in today's episode, we'll just be uncovering the state that led to networks being mandatory. And in the next couple episodes, we'll dive into the mechanisms that then glued that filial network together. Today's episode, within the confines of a family network, is, why does a family network even exist? And if we can answer this, we're very close to understanding why any network exists. So, our investigation takes us deep into the myths, into the mythic, prehistoric era, roughly 7 million years, where humans and Homo sapiens and genus Homo are still millions of years away. 7 million years ago, in the Miocene, we roamed the African rainforest, not the African savannas, but we were indulging in dense, lush rainforests in the African subcontinent, where anthropologists have labeled this species, this type of primate, not far removed from the great apes, and forgive me for butchering this Latin, Sahelanthropidensis, or simply put, the Tumai. And these characters are much more ape than they are human, but they inhabit an incredible ecosystem. That ecosystem would resemble more today the Amazon rainforest than sub-Saharan Africa. But this is Africa, and this is enormous amounts of trees, of foliage, and our favorite snack at the time, leaves. We were still knuckle walkers. We could climb trees like monkeys, and we loved eating leaves. And there were tons and tons of leaves in densely packed forests for us to enjoy. And we spent most of our days eating and digesting food, trying to extract the calories from the leaves, and not thinking much about what the future held in store. Apart from eating, we had another evolutionary calling, which is to reproduce. And as a male primate in this era, it was pretty good. We were definitely not pair bonding as of yet, and we were not providing food or resources for our female counterparts. We were participating in what can only be titled tournament mating. Tournament mating is essentially a type of sexual dimorphism whereby the male charts out territory for himself, fights off or scares away all the other males, and provides grazing ground for females to come, for him to copulate with them, and essentially leave them once the copulation is done. Leave them, he did. Because at this point, the mother in this equation was completely independent. The male was in charge of territorial management. The mother was in charge of fostering, raising, and providing for the infant. And I will tell you why that's possible, and that's a very important part in our story. But our friends in this era, again, trying to butcher the name, the Sahelanthropidensis, lived a pretty great life as far as primates go. However, their offspring and their offspring after that would not be so lucky. So now let's fast forward about 2 million years. So from 7 million years ago, now we're about 5 million years. The Tumei, the Sahelanthropus tradensis are long distant memories by now. I don't think it's possible for people in the modern era in 2026 to comprehend that I just fast forward 2 million years. We have no reference, no capacity no inkling of what 2 million years is, but it's a long time. And life goes on. Now we're introducing a new character. His name is Ardi, and we call him Ardi because the long form name for his type of primate is the Ardipithecus. So Ardi is much simpler. And Ardi is a descendant of the Tumai and is very similar to the Tumai. Still tournament breeding, still basically knuckle walking. But things are starting to change. And by things, I mean the climate. The earth is slowly starting to cool down. At this point, and this cooling is changing the topography of the forests in Africa. What used to be very dense, rich, teeming forests where trees were very close together and food was very easy to find, starting to get a little bit further away. Basically, the forests are starting to be further and further away from each other. They're still forests, they're still lush, but they're distances now. And this means we have to introduce a new action for Ardi. An action that, is as consequential as so many other things in this, and that is walking upright. What Ardi realizes slowly is that knuckle walking, although great for explosive power and climbing trees, is extremely exhausting when you have to do it for long distances. Some estimate that it is 75% less efficient calorically than walking upright. And this used to never be a problem when everything was so close together. When the rainforest and the trees and everything 2 million years before this was much more dense, walking long distances was not a priority. But as the forests to become more desperate and further away, realizes that if you walk upright, which could only be an incredibly bizarre and uncomfortable thing to do at the beginning, if you, for the entire evolutionary history of your species, then now decide to walk upright, I would look very silly. But realize that if you can get over that little silly, awkward phase, much more calorically efficient, he was able to walk much further with much less energy than before. Like all good things in evolution, the selection pressure increases in what can only be called a virtuous or vicious cycle, where the better you became at bipedalism, walking upright on 2 feet, the more food you got to consume, the less competition for that food, and the more it reinforced its winning strategy. And started to perfect this. He saw within his progeny, his offspring, that they were slightly better than him at walking upright because they would do it more frequently. But then they started to lose the ability to climb slowly but surely. Of course, they would still embarrass any modern human climber, but walking upright does mean that you're not exercising in continuous motion those two other limbs of yours. And if Ardi was to sit back and watch his fellow primates, he would notice, apart from the wobbling and lack of balance and getting better at that, he would notice, wow, those two hands, arms, are freed up now. I wonder if there's something that we can do with them. And Ardi would pass on bipedalism into his progeny, and we will forward again the evolutionary clock by about 2 million years. And now we are at 3 million years ago. Again, an obnoxious jump in time, and still kind of unfathomable. But this 3 million years ago period, things start to become very interesting. We introduce our newest primate friend, the Australopithecus, and we are starting to really hedge down the barrel of humanization, because Australopithecus is no longer a awkward knuckle walker trying to walk upright. Rather, he is a professional bipedalist, and his body has adapted over the last couple million years to being able to walk upright. The first thing the body did is it had to adjust the abductor muscles on the outside of your hips so that you don't fall every time you took a step, and turning it into a bowl-shaped object. And this is what gives modern humans, as well as the Australopithecus, its mobility on 2 feet. It also shrank the birth canal for women. It also engendered what we would now look at as modern curvature and the different positions that we are comfortable with our legs. Apart from being a great walker, was having a lot of trouble. And the reason for that is because 2.5 million years, which is roughly 500,000 years into the Australopithecus story, the Earth's thermostat breaks and it starts to get very cold, very fast, evolutionarily speaking. And as the world starts to get cooler and cooler, Africa starts to dry up. This is known as the Great Aridation. Everything becomes dry. What formerly were forests full of canopy and trees and foliage now became the much more recognizable and iconic African savannas. Obviously, it didn't happen that fast, but this is the trajectory. What was before a concentration of leaves and food now became open grasslands where everything was at competition with each other. Now, not only do you have to walk between forests, which you've evolved and adapted to do with your brand new bipedal specializing legs and pelvis, but literally, you're witnessing the disappearance of forests altogether. And if it were just a linear path straight to some African savanna where everything looks like a modern day Lion King show or Lion King set, that would be fine. Evolution over several millions of years would figure that out. But that's not what happened. During this climatic destabilization, nothing was predictable. Literally, one generation during this period of time could be living in grasslands, and the next generation in a desert, back to a forest, and so on. And so you were witnessing drying out, and you're also witnessing the inability for physical evolution to materialize its adaptations because the climate was so unstable from generation to generation. And this climactic breakdown would be the petri dish in which the trade-offs that would change evolution forever and would be the birthplace of the original network economy, the brain enlargement, also known as encephalization, the brain enlargement that was about to follow, the mass coordination of humans that were about to follow, and the unification of the family unit, going from copulation as a means of reproduction to copulation being the first tiny little step in what would be a mutual agreement to raise the offspring even after they're born, would all stem out of this climactic change. So how did that happen? For that, we got to dive into two stimuli. I read a lot about the different theories on why, at this point in human history, the Australopithecus were the right primate, on why 2.5 million years ago was the right time for, let's start with encephalization. Let's start for what would become the brain enlargement period. The first reason was this aridation of the African landmass meant that we had to find different sources of energy. Leaves were just not going to cut it anymore. And we have been eating leaves and digesting food most of our day for millions of years. And so, to switch it out, we decided to eat animal protein. In other words, we went from being grazers to being hunters. And this is the first of two stimuli. The other stimuli is even more brilliant and staggering. But this first stimuli, the meat connection, as some people call it. So meat is way more energy dense than leaves, as you can imagine. And because we started to eat meat, mostly because it was more accessible, it was more consistent, and in the open savanna, it was a better predictable fuel source than leaves were, especially in climactic variability. And because we started to eat meat, we didn't need to spend so much time digesting, so our digestive tracts shrunk, which saved an enormous amount of our daily energy expenditure. Good thing there was a rapidly evolving organ inside of your body that was more than willing to swallow up that extra energy, and that was the brain. Because the more meat I eat in comparison to my peers, the more digestively efficient my body becomes, meaning I now need to eat less to be able to do more, and with the food I'm eating and digesting, I'm able to send more of those calories to my brain. The selection pressure for speeding up meat consumption as a function of reallocating digestive calories to the brain became very prescient. And one thing, and the other thing is, well, animals are not so cool with you trying to eat them. And a lot of the times they're going to eat you, or they want to eat you because they have similar selection pressures. So an individual human, especially one that has long ago relinquished their brilliant climbing skills and their explosive power and their canine teeth that they used to be able to rip things to shreds with, they've given that up a long time ago. Bipedal Australopithecus is not a physical threat to most animals on the African savanna. And so, with this increasing demand for meat consumption and the implications it had on bigger brains, one of the things, or two of the things that humans began to do, first one is one-on-one with an animal, not good chances. But I do have these two limbs that are very, well, they're not doing much. They're not helping me walk. And they're really not helping me defend myself because you may have noticed human arms, not the greatest weapons in the world. And I want to use these arms to manage tools. And the injection of tools at this point in human history, not saying that it wasn't used before. I mean, there's always been earlier and earlier uncoverings of human tool usage, but at this point in history, it became like a bizarre arms race, because the more efficiently you can use tools, the more meat you can kill, therefore shrinking your digestive tract, therefore leading to bigger brains. Therefore, those bigger brains can help you mobilize more tools. But the greatest tool that humans unlocked during this time was not some inanimate object, was not some weapon forged from the remnants of the earth, but the greatest tool humans uncovered were each other. And instead of the primal instincts of tournament mating, where males would scare each other off or kill competing apes, fellow hunters, being able to assemble themselves in coordinated groups became an ungodly advantage in the hostile African savanna. And this coordination, this primal network, this network selection was fuel poured onto the fire of the meat connection vicious cycle that was already happening. So remember, this is all stimuli one. Because you now live in a savanna, because you're bipedal, because food is harder to find, you started targeting animal protein. You then realized animal protein is more efficient to eat than plants. You then realized animals are not trying to be eaten. You then realized you can make tools. You then realized the greatest tools are each other. And the degree and efficacy in which you are able to coordinate multiple people into hunting bands became the hallmark, not just of survival, but for the first time, of human flourishing, even though they're not humans yet. Okay, so that was stimuli number one for why the brain expansion of the next epoch, encephalization as they call it, why the brain was about to expand so much. But the second stimuli is even more bizarre and incredible. So it's called the variability selection hypothesis. And this goes back to the fact that the climactic changes were not linear, in the sense that they were not just getting drier and drier and drier. Mother Nature kept throwing curveballs down the plate. And as I mentioned, all these random climactic changes essentially spat in the face of evolution, because physical evolution is very slow, very slow. It took millions of years for us to become bipedal. Let's adapt everybody to that. And it does, these physical mutations and selects the adaptive reproductive qualities and so on. By the time the evolution manifests itself, the climate changed again, and we're now in an environment where whatever you just deem to be adaptive is not, and you're dead. So at this point, evolution made a preposterous bet and said, we're not going to invest the calories and the generations into becoming adaptive across one environment, because we don't know what the environment's going to be. What we are going to do, however, is we are going to change the way the brain itself works. We are going to essentially perform a software update, not a hardware update. Poor analogy, but good for visual purposes. Instead of changing the human body, we are going to invest all of the evolutionary pressure into essentially building a bigger processing unit and connecting those processing units to as many other processing units as possible. In other words, evolution took a bet on cognitive flexibility, and it was the bet of all bets, because it worked out beyond any imaginable outcome. 2.5 million years ago, we are maybe an averagely moderate competitor in a part of the African subcontinent, looking for resources and struggling at that. And there's still a lot of predators, and most of the world is yet foreign and uninhabited by us. And over the next 2.5 million years, these Lopithecus and their descendants, and their more famous descendants, like genus Homo, and of course Homo sapiens, would go on to conquer every inch of landmass on planet Earth, virtually conquer all of the physical elements, would subdue nature, and would start to extract resources from nature, would easily dominate over every other species on planet Earth, and would restart kind of primal ape-like infighting in between each other. That's how dominant Homo sapiens became. They took over the world. This is the direct outcome of this innovation, evolutionary innovation, where the environmental variabilities forced the evolutionary process to say, we are going to take a bet on the largest possible brains we can manage, and then once we hit the biomechanical limitation of what our body can house as our brains, we are going to connect our brain to as many other brains as possible in concurrent processing networks. And we're going to build network on top of network and compound the advantages of our gigantic brains and essentially unlock the network economy in a way that would literally create economy of all types. It is unfathomable how important this I always mess up this word, the enlarging of brains was. And more importantly than the enlarging of brains was this virtualization of this software, where it said, we will not stop at the roughly 1400 centimeters cube of an adult male brain. We will now connect these brains to every other possible brain so that we can compound these advantages. And nature selected heavily in favor of this. Let me give you some statistics about what our brains did over the next 2 million years. So at the time, the average brain, full adult brain, came out to about 500 centimeters cube. Obviously, numbers vary. Some people say 400, but let's just go with 500. So the Australopithecus had fully adult male brains, roughly about 400 to 500 centimeters cube. Today, the average adult brain is 1,400 centimeters cube. That is almost 3x what the Australopithecus was. So we're talking about, in the span of 2.5 million years, a 3xing of an organ in terms of adult size. That type, first of all, just think about that. The brain was already consuming an ungodly amount of energy at the time of Australopithecus. Now the brain consumes something like 25% of all calories. It provides no defensive posture in terms of predation. It's not even visible. And yet, all humanity has agreed that larger brains means more survival, more reproduction. 1400 centimeters cube became the literal limitation before things started to go a little overboard on the caloric requirements, the metabolic requirements of the brain. And it became the sweet spot. And we're still at 1400. But we didn't stop at that bio limit. We extended it by connecting brains to every other brain that we can imagine. Now, why did we do that? Because it's obviously, saying it in hindsight make lots of sense. Let's say 1400 is the largest, and now we don't want to stop there because, we have to invent language and math and literature, and we have to invent so much in software and food. Not food, but agriculture and things. So we have a lot of invention to do, and we have a lot of requirements for our brain. So we don't want to put a limitation on it, especially one that's just a bio limitation because of the way that our metabolic system is built. And we've already 3x'd it. So of course we want to connect them to each other. But if I were to tell you why the first network in terms of the family network manifested itself, when I understood this, it was unbelievable. And it has nothing to do with wanting to be there for your kids or wanting to be good parents or wanting to actually build this network. As I told you before, the ancient Tumai, the early 7 million years ago primates, the males would copulate and not disappear, but they would stay in their grazing grounds, but they would not be providers. They definitely not pair bonding. There's definitely no genuine concern that I will have to participate in the long-term caretaking of the mother and the child. The family network is a non-starter until this enlargement of the brain. And the reason for this is so funny, so one of those things of human history that you can't believe. And so let me explain it to you. So remember when I told you that to become bipedal, we made the trade-off that we would shrink our pelvises, essentially fix the abductors and shrink our pelvises, give us butts. And that worked really well. That made us bipedal, made us really walk fast. I also mentioned that that would shrink the birth canal for the mother. So now you have a limitation on the size of the infant that can be housed during pregnancy. And for 5 million years, no problem, because this brain enlargement wouldn't happen. We were bipedal for at least a couple million years before the brain enlargement of the Australopithecus would happen. But once this brain enlargement started happening, you are now essentially in an evolutionary contradiction, an evolutionary trap. And then have the highest chance of sexual selection and natural selection. You want the biggest brain possible. But the biggest brain possible is going to kill this mother and the baby during pregnancy. The mother, at best, can hold healthily 400, 350, let's say, centimeters cube. And that's pushing it. Because right before the water breaks, you're essentially fully maxing, complete maxing how much metabolic output the mother is able to give to her and the child, and the child's brain is sucking up such an ungodly amount of the calories, and you're essentially pushing to the limit how much the mother can do. So there was two options for either we not going to have bigger brains because the mother is going to die, and if the mother dies, well, then you're not going to reproduce anyway, or you're going to chain the finishing of the baby's maturation from being pre-birth to post-birth. So one is, and the other one is precocial. Precocial is also where precocious comes from. So a precocial species is one that's born ready to run, born ready to make contact. These are like chimpanzees, where when the birth happens, almost instantly, the infant is looking for contact. All is like a kitten, where the infant is born helpless and will not survive without extra guardians. Humans are actually precocial. So what that means is, as soon as the baby would come out, it would be ready to grab and cling on. The cling effect, they call it. Cling on to the mother's fur, and the mother still had a lot of fur. So this is why it allowed every great ape and primate where the male would just copulate and bounce, because the mother was functioning like solopreneur, could essentially pop out a baby, and the baby would not be a passive somebody that needed to be carried. They didn't need to be carried. They could cling on to the mother. Well, now the mother can't go anywhere. The mother can't use her arms to gather food, kill things, scavenge, and get food for you and the baby. We essentially kept the brain small enough until Australopithecus, where until Australopithecus, the mother pops out, the baby is ready to kind of hold on, and the mom starts getting all of the resources that's required, and the dad is just marking out territory and really not paying attention. In other words, the father can copulate and have a pretty good sense that his progeny, how much ever he does, is going to survive. I think until like the 1900s, that was the case with humans. I mean, even now, that's not the case with humans in some cases. And that's because during this time, we became what anthropologists call secondary or altricial. So altricial means like kittens, where they're completely helpless. Secondary altricial means we're supposed to be precocial. We're supposed to be ready for contact and not be such a burden on the mother. But because the brain, the demand for bigger brains was not going to be sacrificed. And evolution was not going to give it up. It was too lucrative. It was too helpful. So what evolution did is said, all right, the rest of this development process happens after you come out of the womb. So it's the ratio. What is the ratio between the baby that's coming out, let's say, or the human infant, but like a Homo sapien, a genus Homo post-Australopithecus, what is the ratio? And most primates, like the Australopithecus and prior, they're coming out 40% ready. That 40% is what's ready to cling. The nervous system is ready to keep track. Humans, on the other hand, or post the enlargement of the brain, they're basically coming out 25% ready. And this is basically 370 centimeters cube, which is still enormous. Like, it's still at risk of killing the mother. But of a 1,400 centimeter cube brain, it's nothing. So much of this infant's development, especially nervous system development, is going to happen after birth. And that makes the mother essentially a stationary metabolic consumer. She's no longer able to go scavenge and hunt and grab resources. The baby's not just clinging to Heather while she's climbing from trees and running across the savannas. She's now going to have to hold this baby. And she can't do anything. She can grab some food from the ground. She can essentially become a gatherer. And she's going to need not just her husband, or not husband at the time, not just the father of the child, but she's going to need a network, a filial network, to help raise this kid. You may have heard it takes a village to raise a kid, and that's true. And that's because this entire issue is called the obstetrical dilemma. The obstetrical dilemma is the fact that we wanted bigger brains, but we had small pelvises for bipedalism. And so we pushed the rest of the development post-birth. And because we pushed the rest of the development post-birth, the mother alone could not fend for the child and also gather resources, thus bringing together the nuclear family, or the initial versions of the nuclear family. And not just that, but also bringing together things like grandparents and other kinship, everybody who was going to participate in altruistic fitness. Essentially, people who are going to sacrifice their immediate calories, their immediate pleasure, their immediate ability to survive in some cases, so that the next generation and the mother has a better chance of getting through the infant to adolescence. And it is because of that requirement and the fact that if you did not do that, you as a male that just copulated and left this big brain child that's underdeveloped in the hands of this mother who now has to carry this thing everywhere, you are not going to push your genes through into posterity because it's going to die without you being able to go hunt and bring back these new animal-rich proteins and all these things that are being unlocked on the other side where you have kind of tribal networks. You now have the formation of the nuclear family network. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to talk about the neurochemical requirements, in other words, the encryption code that binds this software and stamps it into the evolutionary history books as the methodology that we are still practicing today, which is the nuclear family, which is the infant needs to be taken care by two parents and more, and that is going to be the vital network which underpins all future networks, which then underpins the network economy. I'm going to be talking about the neurochemicals and the kind of funny economic conditions that exist within a family, and how that familial network is the foundation, is the bedrock of modern civilization. When I say modern compared to these guys, we're talking about just, any civilization. I hope that I was able to give you a high-level overview of how we transitioned over the last, 7 to 2.5 million, and then really into this brain enlargement period, and how brain enlargement became the software update that can house this network processor, and how that is why we crave networks today. That is why we crave them. That is why they're so efficient. That is why everything that we look at today, all civilization, all invention, all progress, all lack of progress, is because of the grip that networks have on our lives. And that grip goes so deep into the archaic roots of our evolutionary history. Thank you for listening to episode 1 of the Network Economy podcast. Thank you.